The air outside smelled like cedar and late November rain. Madison Hartley sat in her rented Ford Explorer at the edge of the cul-de-sac engine, still humming headlights casting long shadows across the weathered garage door she knew too well. Suburban Seattle hadn't changed much. Neither had the house white trim faded to gray porch light, flickering like it had been meaning to die for years, and that same wind chime still clinking faintly by the kitchen window. She took a breath. Let it out slow. Her palms were steady, calloused from field days inspections and command training, but her chest felt heavy in a way no uniform ever prepared her for. That weight never came from combat. It came from home. Inside that house they were waiting. Her mother had called it a family dinner, but she knew better. It was a celebration for Ethan, the golden son, the one who followed the plan. Tonight, he was being toasted for his new promotion as Director of Systems Integration at Dominion Aerospace, a title long expected, like the family had carved a throne out of corporate pride, and Ethan had simply stepped into it. Madison opened the door. The cold bit at her heels. She pulled her coat tighter, walked the cracked stone path, and rang the bell, even though she knew it was always left open. Madison, her mother's voice, floated from the kitchen light and distracted. "It's open, sweetie." She pushed the door gently. Same smell. Garlic overcooked, roast, lemony floor cleaner. The foyer still held the same framed photos, Ethan's graduation, his wedding in Aspen, his kids in matching Christmas sweaters. Her own image in uniform taken at her commissioning ceremony was nowhere to be found, not even the photo she'd mailed on her first deployment to Germany. The silence greeted her like an old rival. In the kitchen, her mother stirred something in a ceramic pot. "Dinner's almost ready. Ethan and Rachel are on their way. You'll be so proud of him. He's leading a massive project, something tied to national defense. Top secret, but you know how that goes." Madison gave a small nod. "Yeah, I know a thing or two about that." Her mother laughed absently, missing the point entirely. "Make yourself comfortable. We saved your spot at the table. You still like the end chair, right?" The end. Always near the doorway, always one step from leaving. She walked into the dining room. 6 places set with her mother's wedding china. Ethan's seat at the head, her father's to his right, her mother next to both, hers. No name card, but its position was obvious. Not in the spotlight, not even in the frame. The doorbell rang. Loud voices, coats rustling Ethan's familiar laugh. He walked in like he belonged to the air. Rachel followed, polished and crisp, in a camel trench coat, balancing a bottle of red she'd never drink, mad. Ethan pulled her in for a quick hug, already looking over her shoulder. "Can't believe it's been, 5 years?" "6," she replied. He blinked. "Wow, really feels shorter." It didn't. Dinner was served promptly. Her mother's roast dry at the edges, mashed potatoes with too much butter, and the iceberg salad that never left the menu since Madison was 12. Conversation moved quickly. Ethan detailed his team's work defense software optimization cloud-based simulation labs and a recent contract with the Department of Defense. "It's huge, game-changing. We're doing Phase 2 rollout this quarter." "You'd love it if you were still into that kind of thing." "I am," Madison said calmly. "Still very much into it." Her father chuckled. "What are you now, a captain?" She sipped her water. "Not quite." Rachel leaned in. "Do you ever miss normal work? Like stability, having a 5-year plan?" Madison didn't flinch. "I have a 5-year plan, and I write them for nations." No one replied. She let them talk. Let her father beam as Ethan explained how they'd lead cyber integration for Project Helios, a multi-million-dollar contract designed to protect the country's critical infrastructure. Madison knew every line of that proposal. She had signed off on the funding 6 weeks ago. But she said nothing. Not tonight. Her fork moved methodically. Chew, swallow, smile, repeat. Let them have this evening. Because tomorrow at 0800 sharp, she would walk into Dominion's executive boardroom, not as a guest, not as Ethan's little sister, but as Colonel Madison Hartley Department of Defense Liaison Officer for Joint Cyber Command, with final approval authority for the very project they had toasted over potatoes. She looked around the table, at Ethan's easy grin, at her father's prideful gaze, at her mother who'd never once asked what Madison actually did in the Air Force. Let them have tonight. Let them believe she was still wandering, still chasing orders, still somewhere between assignments with no direction. Because the silence she held now wasn't surrender, it was strategy, and tomorrow that silence would end. She used to think the hallway was longer. Back when she was 15, barefoot and breathless from running up the stairs with her college brochures tucked under one arm. Princeton, Georgetown, Stanford. She had left them carefully arranged on her father's desk, believing that would make him proud. It didn't. He hadn't even looked at the ones without Ivy League logos. The second floor of the house was quiet now, its walls lined with photo frames that had aged better than the people who put them there. Ethan at Yale in his cap and gown, arms flung wide with victory. Ethan again at his wedding center stage under a white canopy in Martha's Vineyard. Ethan holding his son in one arm and a Defense Tech trophy in the other. No trace of Madison. She paused in the hallway, her boots soft on the faded carpet, and stared at a blank patch of wall where a nail still stuck out crooked and rusting. She wondered if that's where her high school honor roll certificate used to be. Or maybe the newspaper clipping from the state science fair where she'd taken first place with a project on drone flight algorithms. She remembered the headline, "Local Girl Soars Above the Competition." It had been pulled down the week after she told them she wasn't applying to Harvard Business School. Instead, she'd chosen the Air Force. Her father's reaction still rang clear in her mind, as sharp as a breaking plate. The military, he'd said, not raising his voice, but lacing it with a disgust colder than shouting. "Madison, that's for people who don't have options. You had a future." His version of the future. Madison had seen it laid out like a corporate blueprint since she was 12. MBA at Wharton. Internship at his firm. Gradually earning her way no faster than Ethan, of course, into a respectable, clean upward title. Executive Vice President, maybe even COO if she smiled enough and never challenged him in meetings. But she had wanted something else, something that didn't require her to apologize for being sharp, fast, or commanding, something that didn't ask her to shrink. When she received the acceptance letter into the Air Force Academy, she had expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was erasure. They didn't come to her commissioning. They didn't attend her graduation. Her mother sent a card 2 weeks late, addressed simply to Maddie with no rank. Her father never returned her call. She had spent that night alone in her dorm room, dressed in formal blues, with a silver bar on each shoulder and a quiet ache in her chest. The ache didn't come from the silence, but from the knowledge that it had been deliberate. Back home, the family holiday letters never mentioned her. They spoke of Ethan's growing team, Rachel's foundation work, and the grandkids' tennis schedules. If Madison was referenced at all, it was vague, still traveling a lot, or somewhere overseas. Like she was a lost package no one had claimed. She sat on the edge of her childhood bed now. The quilt still the same one her grandmother made before passing, patchy and soft-stitched with tiny birds and muted blues. The room was frozen in time, a shrine to a version of her that had vanished the day she swore the oath. Basketball trophies, National Honor Society pins, early acceptance letters. Everything before, nothing after. It was like she'd stopped existing once she chose her own path. She glanced at the nightstand, where a cracked lamp sat beside a dusty high school yearbook. Her fingers reached for it on instinct. When she flipped to her senior photo, she saw herself bright-eyed, confident, hair curled just right. The caption underneath read, "Most likely to lead." How fitting! She had led task forces in 5 countries, managed cyber warfare readiness drills that protected entire regions of infrastructure. She had been the youngest officer to ever brief a congressional subcommittee on digital threat escalation. But in this house, she was just the girl who left. No matter how many medals she'd earned or how many people saluted her, there was always a silence when she called, a polite pause, a subject change, like military service was some hobby she'd outgrow. There's a peculiar cruelty in being forgotten by the people who once claimed to know you best, but there's also freedom. Madison stood and walked to her suitcase. She unzipped it slowly, revealing the carefully folded uniform beneath layers of civilian clothes. Her fingers brushed over the silver eagle insignia stitched above her nameplate, Colonel Hartley. Not a nickname, not a maybe, not someone's sister, not someone's disappointment. Just her. This house had forgotten her. But she hadn't forgotten who she'd become. If she had followed their path, she might have earned a corner office, sure. But it would have been one with glass walls and no soul. She might have earned applause at boardroom meetings, but never the deep-earned silence of a mission accomplished in hostile territory. Never the midnight briefing with lives on the line. Never the knowing nod from another officer who recognized her command without words. Madison Hartley had chosen differently, and it had cost her the applause of her own blood. But it had given her something they couldn't manufacture: integrity forged in fire leadership without apology, and the quiet resilience of someone who did not need to be seen to exist. They had painted her out of the picture. But tomorrow, she would redraw the frame entirely. The room smelled like old pine drawers and sun-faded laundry detergent. It was the same smell from high school nights and early morning SAT prep, the same room that once held her dreams in the form of dorm posters and folded scholarship letters. Now it held only stillness and a suitcase that hadn't been opened since she arrived. Madison knelt beside the bed, her back straight, even in silence. The zipper on the suitcase gave a soft hiss as it pulled open. No rush, no drama. This was a ritual. She peeled back layers of folded black slacks, a navy sweater, and a toiletry bag until her hand met a familiar fabric. Midnight blue pressed with precision, weighted with meaning. She lifted it carefully, like it could bruise under careless fingers. Her dress uniform was folded perfectly, just as it had been when she left Andrews Air Force Base 3 days ago. Still crisp, still ready, still waiting for this moment. She laid it out across the bed. Every stitch was in place, every insignia aligned. The silver eagle rank glinted faintly under the soft yellow light of the bedside lamp. Her nameplate. Hartley sat firm against the fabric, a quiet assertion of presence. She pulled up the wooden chair from her childhood desk and sat beside the uniform like one might sit beside a fire, close enough to feel the heat, far enough to respect the power. This wasn't about revenge. Not tomorrow. Not ever. Revenge would have required rage. And Madison had long since moved past that. This was about precision. She reached into the side pocket of the suitcase and pulled out a small cloth case. Inside her ribbon rack, 4 rows deep. She began lifting each piece, gently lining them against the uniform jacket, adjusting the placement with practiced ease. Air Force Achievement Medal, Meritorious Service, NATO Operations Ribbon, Cyber Command Commendations. They weren't stories, they were receipts. She polished the metal with a white cloth, slow circular strokes, not to make them shine for anyone else, but because excellence begins long before the room you walk into. It had taken her years to understand something that military culture had taught her. In silence, you don't explain your worth. You wear it. In corporate rooms, people post their resumes. In her world, you walked in with your record on your chest. She didn't need them to understand the hierarchy of military awards, the layers of responsibility, or the pressure of authorizing decisions that affected hundreds of lives. She didn't need to list her deployments or name-drop the generals she'd briefed. She just needed to show up, fully, and let the truth speak louder than any defense. In the quiet, her fingers moved with muscle memory. Button, thread, align, repeat. She checked every seam, every angle. She clipped the medals in perfect symmetry. The hem of her skirt lay evenly across the duvet. Her shoes, a low, polished pair of black heels, sat beside the bed, already shined. The night stretched on. Somewhere downstairs, a dishwasher hummed faintly. In the hallway, the thermostat clicked as the heating adjusted. In her old room, time folded in on itself, past and present sitting side by side. On the desk was a copy of a children's book she once loved. The Girl Who Climbed Quiet Mountains. She flipped it open, finding the inscription from her mother in looping handwriting, "To Madison, who will always find her own way." She had, but no one stayed long enough to see it. Until now. She stood and removed the plain gray sweater she'd been wearing since dinner, folding it neatly on the chair. In the full-length mirror by the closet, she held the uniform jacket to her shoulders, slipped her arms through, fastened the buttons one by one. It felt like armor, but not the kind made of steel. It was the kind forged by years of being unseen, by choices no one celebrated, by victories that didn't come with champagne toasts or family dinners. She adjusted the collar, smoothed the sleeves. Her reflection stared back steady, composed, unflinching. This was not the same girl who had begged for her father's approval, who had waited for a phone call that never came after her first overseas mission. This was a colonel. The insignia wasn't just a rank, it was proof. Of what she had built, of what she had led, of what she had survived, without shortcuts, without applause. In the morning, when she walked into that boardroom, and every suit turned to look, there would be no questions left to ask. Her presence would be the answer. Because in America, power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it walks in quietly, dressed in midnight blue, with a badge that doesn't beg for recognition but commands it. She looked one last time in the mirror. No hesitation, no need for words. They had spent years talking over her. Tomorrow, they would listen. She reached for the small silver watch she wore on duty, adjusted the time. 22:41. 4 hours until she'd rise. 5 until she'd stand before them. She turned off the light, let the house sleep, let the city rest, let the past fade. She was ready. The cold morning air wrapped around her like clean steel. Madison stepped out of her rental, the sound of her low heels clicking against the parking structure's concrete floor. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the hills of Renton, but Dominion Aerospace's headquarters was already humming cars, pulling in lanyards, swaying voices, muffled by glass doors and early caffeine. Her steps were unhurried, precise. Not because she was trying to make a statement, but because people who carry real weight never need to rush. She adjusted her collar. The midnight blue Air Force dress uniform fit like it always did, tailored by discipline, defined by memory. The silver eagle insignia gleamed under the muted light, and ribbons adorned her chest in silent formation, not decoration, but declaration. At the glass doors, the security guard glanced up. His eyes widened, then straightened. "Good morning, Colonel." "Morning," she replied. Voice calm, clipped. He scanned her DOD credentials without question and opened the gate without hesitation. No one asked who she was or why she was there. Because the uniform spoke first. She passed the reception area, each turn memorized from floor plans she had studied for weeks. She didn't need directions. She already knew where this was going. The elevator ride to the 9th floor was silent, just her and the reflection in the mirrored doors. For a fleeting moment, she wondered how it would feel seeing their faces. Her father, Ethan. The men who had spoken over her at the dinner table, who had spent years convinced she was lost, drifting aimless. They were about to find out exactly where she'd landed. The doors opened with a soft chime. And there he was, Ethan standing just ahead, flipping through a digital tablet, brows furrowed like a man preparing for another easy win. He was dressed to impress but relaxed, confident in his terrain. Until he saw her. He froze, blinked twice. "Madison." "Wait, what is that?" She didn't stop, didn't smile. "Good morning, Mr. Hartley. I'm here for the project review." Behind him, her father's voice emerged from a cluster of executives. "Mads, what's going on? Why are you in—" He looked at her uniform like it didn't belong in this building, like it was some kind of costume. His words trailed off into the air between them. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. Sharp, warm, familiar. "Colonel Hartley." A woman approached from the far hall, sleek black suit, cropped silver hair posture, like a CEO who'd survived boardroom wars and emerged stronger. Madison turned. Ms. Sullivan, she said, offering a firm handshake. You didn't mention you'd be joining in person. The woman smiled. A welcome surprise. We're honored. I thought it was time, Madison replied, her voice steady. I prefer face-to-face when final approvals are on the line. Behind her, the room went still. Then Sullivan turned to the group. Everyone, for those who haven't had the pleasure. This is Colonel Madison Hartley, our liaison from the Department of Defense. She holds final sign-off authority for Project Lancer. I trust you'll give her your full attention. A silence fell so thick it had weight. Her father's mouth parted slightly. No sound came out. Ethan's jaw clenched. The tablet in his hand dipped just an inch enough to show the tremor in his grip. Madison nodded once and followed Sullivan into the conference room. Her name was already printed on a placard at the head of the table beside the CEO's. She took her seat without looking around. Didn't need to. Presence was enough. Executives began filtering in, some confused, most curious, all suddenly attentive. They shook her hand with the kind of cautious reverence reserved for people who could change the trajectory of a $250 million contract with a single signature. Some looked surprised she was so young. Others looked surprised she was a woman. But none of them questioned why she was there. The meeting began at exactly 0900. Let's begin with a quick word from Colonel Hartley Sullivan, announced. Madison stood, hands placed gently on the table. Thank you. I've reviewed your progress on Lancer's integration protocols. There's progress, yes, but there are also inconsistencies, particularly with the encryption layers. We're not here to rubber stamp assumptions, we're here to get it right. Her tone was calm, clipped, unshakable. Every head in the room turned toward her, including Ethan's. She briefed with surgical clarity, referencing specific line items, cyber threat data, and operational thresholds. She asked questions. She made no small talk. She was not performing. She was commanding. And when Ethan's turn came, his voice was lower, less sure. As lead for systems deployment, he began, I've developed a revised rollout strategy as requested. She nodded slowly. Can you confirm that strategy aligns with the latency benchmarks outlined in the Pentagon's September directive? He hesitated. I can double-check. I think we're close. You'll need to be exact, she said, eyes locked on his. Close doesn't pass military review. He swallowed. Understood. I'll revise accordingly. Yes, Colonel, he added. The room heard it. The meeting moved on. So did she. Not with vengeance, but with presence. When the session closed, people stood slower. Her father lingered in the hallway, not approaching, not sure if he should. He didn't speak, just watched her, the uniform, the posture, the authority. He wasn't the center of the room anymore. Neither was Ethan. Later, as she walked alone down the marble corridor toward the exit, Madison caught her reflection in the glass walls, a silhouette forged in silence now finally seen. She didn't have to raise her voice, because her rank had walked in before her. The room had that sterile scent of filtered air and polished ambition. It was built for power leather chairs, triple screens on the far wall, an espresso bar in the corner that no one used but everyone bragged about. Madison stood at the head of the long conference table, tablet in one hand, the other resting lightly near her insignia, not to draw attention to it, but to anchor herself in what she had earned. This was her arena now. To her left sat Lorraine Sullivan, Dominion's CEO, who watched her with a blend of curiosity and quiet confidence, the way a seasoned leader recognized another. To Madison's right, a half-dozen department leads waited with notepads, spreadsheets, and expectation. Ethan sat near the end posture, straighter than usual, no blazer this time. Just a white shirt, and the look of a man trying to recalibrate everything he thought he understood. Madison didn't rush. Before we dive into projections, she began, voice low but steady. I want to address a few discrepancies in your system latency reports. Page 11 of the October benchmark package, the numbers listed don't align with the Pentagon Security Compliance Memo issued September 12th. She looked up, directly at Ethan. A flicker. Small. But there. I believe you led that section of the rollout. He cleared his throat. Yes, I oversaw the integration timeline and approved the latency range with the core tech team. Then, you'll know, she said gently but firmly, that the acceptable threshold is 60 ms. Your documentation shows a variance of 73. That's not within range. There was no malice, no dramatics, just facts. He shifted slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing on the document like it had betrayed him. I'll have the team rerun simulations, he offered quickly. Make adjustments. We can get it back under. Madison nodded once. That'll be required for continuation. I'll need the revised submission by Thursday, close of business. A pause. Then low and measured, he replied, Yes, ma'am. The words landed like a dropped pin in a silent cathedral. He hadn't said it sarcastically. He hadn't said it with a smirk. He hadn't said it because she was his sister, or because he was trying to play along. He said it because in that moment, he understood. She wasn't there as a sibling or a guest or a surprise reveal. She was the authority in the room. And authority in American tradition doesn't come from bloodlines. It comes from earned ground. Across the table, one of the analysts shifted uncomfortably, as if something invisible had just shifted in the oxygen. Madison moved forward. Let's talk encryption protocols. Your current approach mirrors an outdated RSA framework. That's not acceptable under the new operational directive. You're going to need to pivot to a hybrid lattice model with post-quantum resistance. The CTO blinked. We hadn't anticipated that needing to go into effect this quarter. It should have been anticipated, she said quietly. The directive wasn't optional. No one argued. Because no one could. She wasn't being difficult, she was being correct. For 40 minutes, Madison led them through compliance reviews, data requests, field simulations, and ethical tech boundaries. She spoke with the crisp tempo of someone who had briefed live tactical scenarios at 0300 while cyber systems blinked red. She asked questions, not to trap, but to test, to measure readiness. That was the thing people often got wrong about command. It wasn't about barking orders. It was about seeing the whole field faster than anyone else and making the hard calls even when they made others uncomfortable. She didn't seek control of the room. She simply didn't release it. And somewhere in that hour, even the skeptical faces softened. Not with smiles, but with respect. When the final item on the agenda wrapped, Sullivan turned to her with a professional nod. Colonel Hartley, I appreciate your clarity. Madison offered a faint smile. It's clarity that protects lives, ma'am. Everyone stood. The scrape of chairs and murmurs of regrouping filled the space. Ethan lingered, collecting his materials slowly. He hadn't spoken since the correction. But he hadn't left either. As the others filed out, he approached her. I didn't realize you'd be running the evaluation directly, he said. I always was, she replied, eyes steady. He looked down for a moment, then back up. You were right about the latency. I should have caught that. She didn't respond right away. She let the air breathe between them. You've always been smart, Ethan, she said quietly. But smart isn't the same as thorough. He nodded slowly. Lesson learned. Then softer. You were good in there. Not just sharp commanding. She gave him a small nod. That's the job. He shifted his folder from one hand to the other. You ever think about applying this to corporate leadership? You'd probably run circles around half the people here. I don't need their titles, she said. I already earned mine. He gave a quiet laugh, not mocking, admitting. Fair enough, he said. Then before leaving, and for what it's worth, I meant it earlier, the ma'am. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just held his gaze. I know. He left the room. And Madison stood in the silence he left behind, not triumphant, not bitter, just resolute. This wasn't a battle won. This was a truth confirmed. Respect in this country is not inherited. It's earned. And today she hadn't needed to prove she was equal. She'd shown she was more. The glass walls of the conference room had gone clear again. The room was empty now, just quiet chairs and cold coffee rings on the polished table. Madison stood in the hallway, still in uniform, her nameplate catching the glow of the recessed ceiling lights. She wasn't sure who asked first, her father maybe, or her mother, but somewhere in the shuffle of handshakes and strained stares, someone said, "We need to talk." They guided her toward a smaller side office, one reserved for visiting executives or quiet crises. It smelled like lemon wipes and restrained ambition. The walls were neutral gray, adorned with generic framed photos of mountains and sailboats, pictures that pretended at peace. She walked in without hesitation, posture, unbent boots, silent on the carpet. Her mother was already seated on the leather couch legs, crossed tightly, hands clasped in her lap like she was bracing for turbulence. Her father stood near the window, arms crossed, gaze pointedly avoiding her uniform. Ethan leaned against a filing cabinet folder tucked under his arm like a shield. No one spoke at first. It was her father who broke the silence. "So you've been a colonel for how long?" "6 months," Madison replied evenly. 6 months. He repeated it like it tasted strange in his mouth. "And you didn't think to tell us?" She tilted her head slightly. "I did. I sent invitations to my promotion ceremony, emails, a voicemail the week before. I posted the announcement publicly on LinkedIn. I even sent a printed card to the house." Her mother blinked rapidly as if trying to recall. We didn't see anything like that." "I still have the delivery confirmation," Madison said gently. "I can pull it up if you'd like." A pause. No one asked her to. Her father frowned, still not meeting her eyes. "Why wouldn't you just call I did?" Her voice was calm. Not sharp, not cruel, but steady. "You didn't answer." He opened his mouth to say something, but she continued before he could. "And when you did, the first thing you said was that Ethan was being considered for a directorship. Then you asked if I was still moving around a lot, as if I didn't have a career, as if my life was still some unfinished gap year you hoped I'd outgrow." Ethan shifted, uncomfortable. "We just didn't know you were doing all this." "That's because you never asked," she said softly. "You assumed." Her mother leaned forward, voice trembling. "We thought you were pushing us away, Madison." "No," she said, her tone tightening for the first time. "I just stopped trying to explain my worth to people who already decided it didn't count." The room fell heavy. "You could have made more of an effort," her father muttered. Madison turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I used to think that. For a long time, I believed if I just achieved enough, you'd notice. That one more medal, one more mission, one more rank would earn me a place at the table again." She paused, eyes soft but unflinching. "But I stopped needing your recognition the day I realized I was already enough." The sentence landed like a slow, clean cut. No scream, no flinch. Just truth delivered gently and without apology. Her mother looked down at her hands. Her father looked out the window. Ethan stared at the carpet. Madison stepped back slightly, allowing space between her and their silence. "I didn't come today to prove something," she added, voice quieter now. "This wasn't a gotcha moment. I came because it was my job, because national security is more important than family awkwardness, and because no one else in that room was qualified to do what I do." Ethan finally looked up. "You're good at this." "I know, I mean really good. I saw it today." "I know," she repeated, not cruelly, just without doubt. He nodded slowly. "I guess I just didn't expect it." "We've always been told," she raised one hand, "that I was the soft one, the sensitive one, the idealist. I remember." Ethan glanced away again. Her mother stood unsure, walking toward her slowly. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. "I don't even know if we can, but I'd like to try." Madison studied her mother's face, older now, lines carved by time and stories half finished. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, remorse maybe, or recognition. "I'm not angry," Madison said. "I just don't want to keep chasing a version of belonging that was never built for me." She took a breath. "You don't have to understand everything I've done, but you do need to respect that I did it, that I earned every stripe, that I never needed saving. Only space." Her father stepped forward, finally meeting her gaze. You were right about the encryption issue, he said. You caught something we all missed. That could have been a major delay. She nodded once. That's why I'm here. He swallowed. I underestimated you. And I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But it was enough. Madison gave a small nod, then checked the time. I have another meeting in 15 minutes, she said. We'll be reviewing final risk assessments. If you want to talk more, I'll be back in Seattle this weekend. Her mother smiled faintly. We'd like that. Madison walked toward the door, the sound of her steps soft against the carpet. And as she turned the handle, she heard her father's voice again, not loud, not commanding, but steadier than before. Colonel Hartley, he said. She looked over her shoulder. I'm proud of you. She didn't smile, not yet, but she nodded once. Thank you. And then she walked out, tall, whole, and no longer waiting. 6 months later, Madison's life had settled into a rhythm of quiet clarity. Her one-bedroom apartment sat on the 7th floor of a brick building tucked between 2 embassies in Northwest D.C. From the wide bay windows, she could see the soft sweep of Rock Creek Park on one side and, on clear days, the edges of the Pentagon on the other. It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy, but it was hers, entirely intentionally hers. The living room held only what mattered: a soft gray couch, a bookshelf lined with military history and cyber strategy texts, and 3 carefully framed commendations, not because she needed the display, but because she was done hiding them. The medals weren't polished for show. They were hung at eye level, a quiet affirmation, not of conquest, but of contribution. It was early spring. The windows were cracked open just enough to let in the breeze that carried the scent of cherry blossoms and distant rain. The kettle on the stove began to hum when the intercom buzzed. She already knew who it was. Her mother had texted that morning, something brief and non-intrusive. We're in town if you're free. Just want to see you. No expectations. Madison had hesitated, then simply replied, 3 p.m. is fine. Now at 2:59, the elevator doors opened with a soft ding. She greeted them with a calm smile. Her father carried a flat envelope, weathered at the edges. Her mother held a tin covered with a red and white gingham cloth. Ethan trailed behind, sheepish and wide-eyed, as though stepping into a museum he hadn't earned the right to enter. The first few minutes were the kind of quiet only families can master, the mix of overly polite questions and undercurrent silences. Smells like clean linen in here, her mother offered, placing the tin on the counter. I never understood how you keep everything so tidy. Military habit, Madison said, pouring tea. They sat around her modest dining table, hands folded, conversation scattered. It wasn't awkward, just unfamiliar, like learning how to speak with people you once only knew through roles. Her father cleared his throat. I brought you something, he said, offering the envelope across the table. Inside was a page torn carefully from a defense industry journal. At the center, a full-color photo of Madison in full uniform standing beside General Holloway at a cybersecurity summit. The headline read, Digital Fortresses Inside the Mind of Colonel Madison Hartley. Madison looked at it, then back up at him. I've had it framed in my office for the past month, he said softly. I didn't tell anyone at first, just kept it there, to remind myself of what I didn't see coming. She didn't speak, but her gaze held steady. I was wrong, he added. About the military, about you, about what strength actually looks like. Her mother touched her arm. I read that article twice. I had to Google some of the terms. She smiled gently. But I understood the part about protecting things you'll never see. That made sense to me. Ethan, sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke. I used your protocol updates on the new rollout, the one we just submitted to DARPA. He gave a small laugh. You were right again, by the way. It shaved latency by 15%. I'm not surprised, Madison said, a half smile at the corner of her mouth. He nodded. I gave you credit, this time. They all laughed, not loud, not forced, just real. It was the kind of laugh families often forget how to share. As the afternoon faded into gold across the windows, the room warmed. They drank tea, talked about nothing and everything. Her mother asked if she was dating anyone. Her father asked about her thoughts on quantum encryption. Ethan asked where she bought her sofa. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was something quieter and in many ways stronger. A beginning. Later, her father walked to the shelf near the window. He examined each medal. His eyes paused longest on one, the Defense Superior Service Medal. "I had no idea," he said, voice low. "This one? They only give that out for really serious contributions, don't they?" "They do," Madison replied. He nodded slowly. "You built something we don't understand." She didn't soften it. "You never asked to." He turned to face her. "That's true, and I regret that." Another pause. Then, almost too quiet to catch, he added, "You deserved more from us. I'm sorry." There were no violins, no emotional climax, just sunlight, soft and forgiving, stretching long across the hardwood floor. Madison leaned back in her chair, her tea cooling in her hands. She didn't need an apology. Not anymore. What she needed was exactly what was unfolding, an effort however small to meet her where she was, not who they wanted her to be. This wasn't about being better. Her voice broke through, steady. It was about being seen. They all looked at her, not as the daughter who left, not as the sister who chose the wrong path, but as the woman who had walked her own without permission, without validation, but never without purpose. And that finally was enough. As they prepared to leave, her mother wrapped her in a longer hug than expected. Her father lingered at the door as if unsure what goodbye was appropriate now. "You ever need anything, I mean? For the project or just—" He stumbled, then stopped. "I know," Madison said. She watched them go. When the door closed behind them, the room felt the same quiet, warm hers. And for the first time, that quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. The city moved quietly beyond the glass, a soft haze resting over Washington's skyline, where light filtered through low-hanging clouds and the hum of traffic was muffled by the thick windows of Madison's apartment. She stood barefoot, arms crossed loosely still, in the same quiet posture she'd taken when the notification lit up her phone just minutes ago. "RE Strategy Implementation Update. Confidential. Final phase approved. Senate Committee confirmed long-term funding. Your encryption model will become the new federal baseline, FBI Liaison Office of Cyber Operations." The screen dimmed in her palm. She let the phone rest on the counter face down. There was no cheer, no applause, just the whisper of wind brushing the window pane, and the gentle groan of old wood as the building shifted around her. It was a Thursday. It felt like any other Thursday. And yet, it wasn't. She walked toward the window. The city was still waking, office lights blinking on one floor at a time, like stars finding themselves in reverse. Somewhere in the chaos of it all, her fingerprints were now woven into the infrastructure lines of code chains of defense protocols that would outlast her uniform, maybe even her name. Quiet victories, invisible work, unshakable impact. It didn't look like the version of success she was raised to believe in. It wasn't a corner office. It wasn't a last name on a building or a plaque in a hallway. It was something harder to define, but far harder to erase. She rested one hand against the glass eyes, following the flight path of a single bird, arcing high, then cutting clean through the gray. Her reflection stared back at her, not stern, not sad, but still. Completely still. Her voice returned in her own mind, steady, almost detached, like narration from the space just beyond feeling. "They told me I walked away from greatness." The words didn't come with anger. They were simply true. The echo of boardroom conversations she was never meant to hear, family whispers behind closed doors. Mentors who spoke in past tense the moment she chose ROTC instead of Wharton. But they never saw the road I walked instead. She remembered the nights alone in undisclosed bunkers, the blinking lights of surveillance servers, the time she intercepted a live breach targeting an Allied embassy and stopped it cold with a 6-line override she wrote in silence at 3 a.m. She remembered being 26, leading a team of 47, being 28, briefing Joint Command, Being 31, told she was overqualified to speak and underqualified to lead in the same meeting. She remembered all of it. And still she had stayed. I chose truth over approval, purpose over praise. Her gaze dropped to the shelf across the room, the one holding the framed citation, the folded flag, and the photo from her promotion ceremony. No one from her family had attended. Not then. But she hadn't stood alone. Behind her in that photo were dozens of faces, men and women, who'd watched her lead, who'd heard her voice in the heat of crisis, and followed, not because they were told to, but because she had earned it. In silence, with rigor, with results. She exhaled slowly. Her tea, now cold on the table, gave off no more steam, but the scent lingered. Lavender and mint, calm, layered over focus. She turned from the window. The apartment was still. Her laptop rested on the desk, still open to the final report she'd sent off before the confirmation came through. It was the work of nearly 3 years, tested, contested, revised, and delivered without fanfare. She didn't need to explain what it meant. She knew. And now so did they. She picked up her phone again, tapped open her photo gallery, and scrolled back. Past the article her father had brought, past the ceremony, past the candid shot of her mother sitting awkwardly at her dining table, holding a slice of pie she had baked too long, past the awkward group picture they had taken 6 months earlier in her apartment, her family trying. She stopped on one image. A screenshot of a text she had once saved long ago. "You'll never make it past major. It's a dead end. You're throwing it all away." She deleted it. There was no bitterness in her chest, only a quiet, remarkable absence, the silence that follows when a storm finally runs out of sky. She set the phone down, turned off the lamp, let the light of the window stretch across the floor. Outside, the city carried on. And inside she stood still, not because she lacked direction, but because for the first time she didn't need to chase it. Her voice returned quieter now. Not a voiceover, just a truth. And for the first time I chose me. Fade to black. Music low. Strings. No crescendo, just breath. Just light. The story didn't end with applause. It ended with a woman finally seeing herself without needing to be seen. And in that, everything had changed.